Hello and welcome. Here I'm going to be looking at my last round game from the Cherry Blossom Classic. I was able to finish with a pretty convincing win against an FM, and yeah, so let's just go right into it. Here I'm playing white against Aaron Jacobson. He's USCF rated about 2433, so like we're basically about the same rating. He's just like 15 points higher than me, just about. So yeah, like I've said with white in this tournament, I was basically playing every opening. I played e4, d4, and knight f3. In this game, I decided to play e4. I saw that he plays the French, and I figured I did have a pretty good result after all with d3 earlier in the tournament, so why not play this again? And, well, yeah, I would not be disappointed this game. So probably my two best wins from the tournament were as white in this line of the French with e4, e6, d3. So he played a different way than my opponent did earlier. So I played this against Grandmaster Bajarani, and he played the symmetrical line with taking and playing e5, which is just equal. And yeah, I ended up getting a very good position that game. He basically played the main line. Started with the bishop e7, and you can also start with knight f6. It doesn't really matter. And yeah, we get this after knight f3, knight f6, g3, c5. This is just the classical way for black to play. Just develop the pieces on normal squares, put the knight on c6, put pawns in the center, and kind of take it from there. So bishop g2, knight c6, we castle, and after this point, e5, knight d7, I like to play this move c4. This is still the main line. And I mean, this position scores fairly well for white. I think black should have no problem equalizing. Like, playing d3 on move 2 is by no means a critical way of playing against the French. But it is a little bit tricky for black. So the point of playing c4 rather than some normal move like h4 over d1, so white is typically going to be playing for an attack on this part of the board. But before we commit anything over there, we basically take some time to stop black's counterplay. So if black could have another move here, he would basically want to play b5. And right away start gaining space over here, b4 and a5. That is going to be how black hits counterplay against white's coming attack with like h5, h4, h5. And then these typical knight maneuvers like rook e1, then knight d2, knight f1, knight h2, knight g4. So all of these things are pretty well known in this kind of position. And yeah, after c4, I was blitzing out all of my moves here, and my opponent took his first think, so he was probably trying to remember some of his analysis here. And he spent about 9 minutes here, and then ended up playing b5, which is actually one of the sharper ways that black can play this. And luckily it was pretty much the only line that I have like super deep concrete knowledge of. I kind of know the general ideas, but nothing too concrete against other moves that black can play. Like the most common way for black to react is d4, which I think actually is a slight mistake, because it just fixes the structure here. Black never has the option of taking the c4 anymore and then putting a knight on d4. It basically gives white what he wants, because now we can use the e4 square also. So like now white would go back to playing on the king side, play h4, and after queen c7, bishop f4, very normal continuation. Black can still play for a6 and b5, but white is just going to let the tension sit there. And now, because there's no additional tension from the pawn on d5, like white is never really afraid of black taking on c4. All that's going to do is give us an excellent outpost for our knight. And it's just hard for black to make progress here. So, like, even you can play, in this position, actually, yeah, it's white to move. I think, like, white already can start playing moves like knight h2. Just pointing out that you can't actually take on e5 yet, because this rook is hanging, and if you move the rook, the knight will relocate to g4. This knight can stay on d2 to make sure the c4 square is covered, and later it can jump to e4. And already, like, knight f6 check is a looming idea for white in this position. So black has to tread carefully in this kind of situation. Anyway, that was the kind of position I was going for. His move b5 is kind of thought to be an equalizer for black, but I ended up having a very powerful novelty prepared later, a couple moves down the road, that I wasn't actually planning to use this game, but it just ended up happening that we got that position. So the idea behind this is basically black wants to play in Benko Gambit style. If white were to take on b5, black will play knight a5, and then follow up with a6. When he gets really good compensation, like after it takes, bishop takes a6, This is just a classic kind of Benko style pawn sacrifice. All of black's pieces are going to be migrating to the queen side. This pawn in d3 is a nice target for this bishop. And yeah, that's going to distract white quite a bit from the normal kingside attack over here with h4 and maneuvering pieces over here. So yeah, that's not really what white wants to go into. Instead, the strongest way for white to play is actually to take on d5 and then play knight c3. So we're still double attacking these pawns. The pawn in d5 is much more important, so black really can't afford to let white capture that. So knight b6 is pretty much forced here. And now after knight takes b5, it seems that like black just doesn't really equalize here. I mean, if white had taken on b5 in this position, then that kind of gives black what he wants, because he can play knight a5. The pawn in d5 is still really solid, but in this version, it's not quite the same, because now, first of all, this knight is a little bit more active. It can already jump into d6 potentially, and the d5 pawn is softened up, which means this bishop has potentially an open diagonal. And this e-pawn, well, it has nothing in the way, so like it could potentially even go to e6 in some positions. The e-file has already been opened. It just kind of favors white, this slight opening up of the position. And already here, my opponent makes a pretty serious mistake. It's the most natural move in the position. It's bishop a6. And this kind of allows white's main tactical idea here that I had already prepared earlier. I mean, I hadn't really prepared it for this game, but I had just discovered this like probably several months ago, and it was just kind of sitting in my head waiting to be used at the right moment. Probably the best way for black to play this is just to accept that you're going to be down a pawn and play a6, just chasing this knight back. We could go to d6, but that'll just return the pawn. Black will be able to take, and even though white has the bishop here, it's really not that big of a deal. So yeah, instead white would play knight c3. And black can continue playing actively like bishop g4, but even here, white could consider giving back the pawn, just to kind of alleviate some of the pressure. Play h3. Knight d4, queen d1. I think this has all been seen before. And then we give back the pawn in h3, but we play rook e1. And this position, it turns out, it's not so easy for black to play, because we just kind of have this slight structural advantage. Like, white's structure is a little bit more compact. We have only 2 pawn islands. Black has 3 pawn islands. These hanging pawns are all potentially going to be a little bit weak. This a6 pawn potentially is a little bit weak. And this bishop will have to retreat eventually, because otherwise white could consider trapping it with g4. But now white has this really nice maneuver in a2. This knight's not really doing anything on c3. But on f4 it'll be pretty annoying. And also white can play for this d4 break, just to fix these pawns or force one of them to advance. It's nothing too serious for black, like he's only slightly worse, but definitely white is going to have a pleasant positional advantage that he can grind out for quite a while here. So that's probably the best continuation for black. Instead, bishop a6 kind of walks right into my preparation. So here I played this move a4, which actually is a novelty. Basically, like, black's idea is if this knight retreats, then this really isn't so clear. Black is going to play d4 and then c4, and now he's getting a lot of counterplay. If we take this, then black is going to win the exchange. Otherwise, black can take on d3, and then use all these squares for the knights. I mean, that can be a total mess, really. It's anybody's game at that point. But after a4, we pretty much force black into taking this, which tactically he can do. It just undermines the support of the knight. And this is probably why, like, nobody has played this before, because it just seems like this is too easy for black. Like, we're going to take this, get our pawn back right away, and, like, what's the problem, right? But actually, if you look at it deeper, it turns out that black has quite a few issues in this line. And he has to do this right away, because if he just does nothing, like, whatever, queen d7, then white is going to play b3. Now you will not get an opportunity to do this at all, and white's basically going to consolidate the extra pawn and just be a clear pawn off. So knight takes a4 is essentially forced here. And now the point is not to play rook takes a4 here. Then after bishop takes b5, black is even better. Like, the rook will have to go somewhere. I mean, we could swing over to the king side, but there's really no attack. The rook just goes to e8, and bishop h6 can be g6 or bishop back to f8. And all of black's pieces are very active, and white really doesn't really have anything going for him. Next, black can consider like knight b4, attacking the d3 pawn. And yeah, really, like, there's no attack on the king side. Black is totally fine here. The main idea for white is actually to sink this knight into d6. And now we're forcing black to make this exchange, because otherwise you have no way of dealing with this pin on the a file. Like, you can't play bishop b5 right now because the knight controls that square. Queen a5 is very undesirable. You're going to walk into this pin. So you have to take this, and then play bishop b5. And I had still all this prepared. Like, I was blitzing out my moves even up to this point. And he thought for, yeah, I think after a4, in this position, he thought for 16 minutes. So he definitely was not familiar with this. Yeah, and then here I was still blitzing, so it definitely must have been very unpleasant for him to just be in an unfamiliar position with your opponent blitzing out moves. And yeah, the point is just to play bishop f4. We're going to hold on to this pawn on d6, and you can't ever chase this bishop away. Obviously, you can't play g5 right now, and if you play h6, white will just play h4, and you're still not going to play g5. Like, this pawn on d6 is just going to sit there, be a real big thorn in black's position. And meanwhile, these pieces over here on the queen side, like, it looks like black can get active with knight b4, and indeed, in this position, he actually played knight b4 right away, which is one of the critical moves that you kind of have to know, like, beforehand going into this position, because it does look fairly scary. Like, bishop takes d3 is a threat. I mean, black can take on knight, can take with a knight on d3, and, like, white needs to play accurately or to keep the advantage. But yeah, luckily I did know this position beforehand, and there's just a really nasty move here that the engine will tell you, and that is queen d2. So typically, all these engine ideas are going to be full of really nasty, sometimes complicated tactics, and it turns out that, like, black just cannot really take this pawn on d3 without losing material. If you take with a bishop, then that's easy to see. Just take the knight on a4. But if you take with a knight, then even there we can play rook takes a4. The bishop takes a4, we'll take this with a queen, and if you take on f4, that essentially happened in the game. He has nothing better than this. And I mean, yeah, the problem for black is, like, if you try to retreat this knight and now you're threatening to take on d3, then white has a lot of convincing responses. I think, like, you can even just play rook a3 just to simply guard this pawn, but there's also the more direct exchange sacrifice of d4. And after bishop takes f1, I was considering playing this during the game. Like, my knowledge kind of ended after queen d2, and I just knew that taking the pawn on d3, you get 2 minors for the rook, and, like, I figured, okay, if black tries something else, I'll figure it out at the board. And yeah, after knight b6, I was considering this exchange sacrifice, which I think is the best way for white to play. And the point is really, we're going to take this pawn on c5. Like, you can't move this. I mean, if you move the knight, we'll just stay here. We're threatening to take here anyway. You can't move this pawn, you'll lose your knight. And probably the best try is like queen c8, where the idea if you take here, I can take with a queen, and at least I'm defending my knight. But now white can just play rook c1. And, like, we're going to take on c5 and have these 2 monster fast pawns, 2 bishops. It's going to be basically a lost position for black. Like, you can try knight c4 to at least get rid of one of the bishops, but even here I'm still going to take on c5 next move. Black's position is going to be pretty helpless. Like, the pawn's going to be temporarily blockaded, but, or I'm sorry, here that hangs the right. Here you start with b3. So, I mean, anyway, you can't take here because the knight is hanging. After the knight is defended, then we'll take on c5. So, in the long run, these 2 pawns are going to decide the game. And already white has 2 pawns for the exchange. We're not even down material there. So, yeah, like, already this position is just difficult for black. He ends up taking on d3. So, like, here he thought for, yeah, he thought for, what, 3 minutes in this position, and then played knight e4, which is, like, kind of the most natural move. And then after here, I think he realized the problem, and after knight takes d3, yeah, that was another 6 minutes. And I had kind of been accumulating a time advantage at this point, because he's been thinking for so long, so I basically, like, this is move 17, I have the same amount of time that I started with, because we have an increment, and I have a basically 40-minute lead on the clock, and I get close to winning position. So, it's probably, like, the most successful example of opening preparation that I've ever been able to pull off in a game. Basically, by move 17, like, I haven't had to make a single move on my own yet, and yeah, my position is close to winning. So, yeah, here I take on a4, and he takes f4. I had a bit of a think, just comparing the different ways I can get 2 minors for the rook. I ended up going with a more aggressive option of taking on f4, letting him take the rook on f1, and then I actually even took with a king here, because I wanted to keep this bishop on this diagonal. And my idea was after queen takes d6, I would be playing knight h4. This is what happened in the game. And I'm going for, like, a direct attack. Like knight f5, the d5 pawn is hanging, my rook will go to g4, and I'm just going to try and checkmate the king before he can even get close to having these pawns mobilized or get any counterplay on the b file. It turns out this doesn't really, this doesn't quite work. Like black has a very strong defensive resource here that I think we both overlooked. And for that reason, it probably would have been better just to like play positionally. I considered taking on f4 with a queen, and then here black has to take the rook on a1 or on a4, because if you take this rook, then you don't even get the pawn on d6. So taking on a4 forces the queen away, and queen takes d6, and then white can play this positionally. Rook d1, playing his knight e1 to target this pawn. If either of these pawns have to advance, then we can easily blockade them. That's really where the minor pieces will shine here. So like here we just play queen c2 to defend this. Already now, knight g5 is possibly a threat, double attacking h7 and d5, so black would probably defend that with g6. But now, yeah, white completes the plan with knight e1, and there's no way to guard this pawn other than playing d4. But then the knight settles on d3, and once we blockade these pawns, this pawn is not dangerous, the pawn on b2 is easy to defend, the knight can be covered with the bishop. Strategically, this is just winning for white. The pawn on c5 will fall sooner or later, and eventually, like, this pawn will fall. Once this pawn falls, the d4 pawn will fall. Eventually, then white will be able to use this past b pawn. So that's probably the way white should play this position. I decided to be more aggressive like this, and going for knight h4. And luckily, he didn't find the best defensive resource here. So he played probably the most natural move, just defending this pawn, rook a d8. This is a serious mistake, which kind of justifies my play. What he should do is actually play g6. So this is admittedly not super obvious, but the point is after queen takes d5, we don't trade queens, we play rook a d8. So this is very strong. This is probably the move that both of us missed. And the point is if we trade queens, I really have nothing better, by the way, because otherwise, I mean, queen d1 check is coming anyway. So if we trade queens, the endgame is not clear, because now black still has a rook and pawn for the two minor pieces. At this point, like, now my knight and bishop are just kind of silly over here. They're not really targeting anything, and black is very quick with counterplay over here. This b2 pawn is going to be hard to defend, and if I lose this pawn, then all bets are off on who's better, because those two pawns on the opposite side of the board are going to be quite difficult for my minor pieces to stop. So, yeah, this endgame, like, even white has to be careful not to be worse. So probably, like, after g6, I mean, white should not even take on d5. White should maybe even just admit the mistake and like come back with a knight and go back to the correct plan of just playing positionally, get the knight to d3, and try to just blockade the black pawns and then win them in the long run. So anyway, I mean, if he played rook a d8, this definitely helped me to win the game much faster, because now after knight f5, I basically get my dream attacking position. So he plays queen a6 check, king g1, and yeah, at this point, he may be close to lost already, but after his next move, it's definitely gone. I thought the most resilient defense would be d4. I mean, I was threatening to take on d5, and I anyway have like knight e7 check and taking on d5, so you know, you really have no other way to guard this pawn than to push it. But now it's really only a matter of time before I get like bishop f1, b3, bishop c4. All of my pieces are going to be hitting your king. These pawns will be blockaded anyway. Like, I basically have the strategically winning position and an attack on your king. And actually here, white also is winning material right away with rook g4, because there's no way to guard this. If you play g6, you get mated on the spot, to queen h6, queen f6, and this is really nasty, rook h4. I didn't see this during the game, but this would basically, like, this is winning on the spot for white. So yeah, I mean, if you can't play g6, the next move I take on g7, and the position collapses. So instead of that, he plays queen a1 check, which at least pins my bishop, so I'm no longer threatening to take on d5, but it cuts the queen away from the defense of the king. And now, like, rook g4 is a deadly threat. And then, yeah, I mean, your queen will be miles away from the defense. g6, then queen can come into h6, I can still play rook h4. Like, yeah, it's already completely lost at this point. So he plays rook f8. I still have to be kind of accurate because he has this counterplay with rook e1. He also has the idea to trade queens with queen e1. So like, if I just play some slow move like king g2 just to unpin my bishop, then actually black can get right back in the game with queen e1. And this is why I rejected this move. And like the immediate sacrifices don't really lead anywhere. Knight h6, it's playable, but this is actually not super clear. Like I think the engine still prefers white here, but it's not really obvious what's going on. Now I'm down in exchange. The king is wide open, but there's no immediate mate, and yeah, I mean we've sacrificed material at this point. So instead, I found pretty precise continuation. Queen c3, so threatening checkmate. d4 is pretty much forced, and we can simply take the pawn on c5. So yeah, once I had seen that like rook e1, I have a good response, and I can see that d3 he can't play. Those are his only two active moves really, and if he can't do either of them, then yeah, I was not really worried here. So at this point, he spent quite a bit of time. So I think what? I guess he spent only 6 minutes here. And while he was thinking, I guess I figured out by elimination that really his only move was to take on b2, and then I figured out while he was thinking what the win was after that. So, I mean, if he plays d3, then knight h6 is just game over on the spot. If you take it, then rook g4, and because you played d4, the queen switches back to c3, and this is going to be checkmate. And your only other active move is rook e1, but here I can simply play queen c4 to defend the bishop. If I get one more move, I can at the very least take on d4 when black has no counterplay at all. And if you play d3, then we have this familiar idea knight h6 check. And this time it also leads to checkmate. Here, queen f6 and rook g4. So yeah, once I had seen both of those variations, I knew that I could go for this. And he ends up taking on b2. And yeah, like I said, while he was thinking, I had figured out that knight takes g7 just wins immediately here. There's a little bit to calculate, but it's not super hard. It's pretty forcing. So he kind of has to take it. I mean, like I did calculate d3 during the game just to be thorough, but I mean you can take the rook, and even if you play d2, I'm going to check and pick up the other rook, and I'm up too many pieces to count here. So yeah, taking that is essentially forced. But now queen g5 check. Every move is check. It's pretty forcing to calculate. King f8 is forced. If you play this, then I think you are getting checkmate, aren't you? Here, 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 and I guess this will transpose because you're anyway going to get smoked out here. So yeah, king f8, there might be something faster there that I was missing, but oh yeah, king h8 here, I just take on f7, and this is the same checkmate as before. So yeah, you can't do that. King f8 is forced, now queen h6 check. Okay, you can't go here because you're going to get checkmated. And otherwise, king e7 is forced, now queen f6. King d7, and once I had seen this, rook takes d4, you have to sacrifice the queen, otherwise anywhere the king goes on the c-file, I'll play check, and just pick up the queen for nothing. And this position is an elementary win for white. It did still take some time, like he resisted for another 15 moves here, but yeah, I mean, this is completely winning for white. We just have queen and bishop for two rooks, the king is wide open, we're going to easily pick up all these weak pawns, and then our passers on the king side will probably decide the game. So yeah, at this point, I didn't even bother taking this pawn on a7. I felt the pawn on h7 was more important to capture, so I played queen e5 check, king f8, and then I took this guy. The pawn on a7 I can win easily, like anyway. It's not dangerous. So rook d6, now I go back over here, queen h4, king f8, queen b4. Yeah, this is a nice move just to pin the rook, and my point is whatever you do, I actually saw I'm going to win this pawn by force. Like if you play this move, then queen b8 check at the very least is going to pick it up. And what he played in the game was rook d8, but now this really nasty move, queen c5, just wins the pawn on the spot. If you try to defend it, then I think I just play bishop b5, and the rook has to stay guarding its companion on d6, but then I take on a7. So yeah, a5, I take on a5, and then yeah, the rest of this, he could have resigned at this point, but eventually he ended up walking into some fork, so he gets one check in. Okay, then king h8 is, well, everything is losing. I was threatening h5, and bishop takes f7. After king h8, queen h5 check, he resigned, because he's going to use this rook on d1. So that was a fairly good way to end the tournament. Pretty convincing win against, yeah, someone about my rating there. And I would say, yeah, this is probably like the most success I've had with opening preparation. Just basically blitzing out the first 16 moves here. So like up to this point, I was pretty much in my preparation. And it wasn't even something that I had prepared specifically for this game. This is just like knowledge I had sitting in my head from analyzing this opening from however many months ago. So it was definitely good to get a chance to use that over the board. So that's going to wrap it up for this tournament. It was a pretty successful event for me. I ended up finishing with 5.5 out of 9 with a 2508 performance rating. That's USCF. So yeah, I gained a healthy chunk of rating points, and I think the next tournament after this is going to be Cleveland, where yeah, I also had some interesting games there. So I'll be making some recap videos for that one to analyze my games. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.